I never thought jealousy could kill. Not just dreams, but living things. The day I saw my fish floating lifeless in the water, I felt something inside me die too. But the truth has its own current. It always finds a way to rise. This is the story of how my stepbrother's jealousy poisoned my farm, and how honesty, forgiveness, and hard work brought it back to life. Stay with me. This story might just change how you see family and yourself. The sun had barely risen when I first noticed something was wrong. Most mornings, the ponds behind our house shimmered with movement, silver tilapia breaking the surface, water rippling like glass in the breeze. That morning, the air was heavy, and the water lay flat, too quiet. I walked down the slope barefoot, the soil still damp from the night's rain. My fish farm had been my pride for 3 years. What started as a small village experiment, just 2 ponds and a few buckets of fry, had grown into something that fed my family and gave me purpose. I knew each pond like a friend. But as I reached the edge, the silence broke with a faint smell, something sour, unnatural. My stomach tightened. I leaned closer and saw them. Pale bellies drifting near the surface, tails barely moving. A few fish still gasped weakly, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to tell me what had happened. I dropped to my knees. "No, not this," I whispered. I ran to the storage shed, checking every container, every feed sack, every hose. Nothing seemed out of place, but the water smelled of chemicals. That kind of damage couldn't come from nature alone. Someone had done this, someone who knew what it would destroy. For days, I couldn't sleep. I drained the smaller pond to save what fish I could, but most were gone. Every ripple reminded me of the hours I'd spent nurturing them, watching them grow, dreaming of expanding the farm. At first, neighbors came to console me. In a village, word travels faster than the river current. Everyone had advice. Maybe it was runoff from the fields, maybe bad feed, maybe a curse. I nodded at all of it, but deep down I knew this wasn't an accident. It wasn't until I saw my stepbrother, Rohan, standing at the fence that evening that my heart began to harden. He was smoking, leaning casually against the post, as if nothing had happened. We hadn't spoken much lately. He'd once helped me dig the first pond, but when I started earning, our bond cracked. He'd wanted to start his own farm, but never did. "You look tired. Fish business giving you trouble?" I wanted to believe his tone was just teasing, but something in his eyes, sharp, unreadable, made me uneasy. "Something poisoned the water," I replied. He shrugged. "That's the thing about farming. Luck can drown faster than a fish." He flicked his cigarette into the mud and walked away. The faint hiss as it landed felt like an omen. That night, I sat beside the pond until the crickets took over the silence. The moonlight glinted off hundreds of lifeless scales. The smell of decay mingled with the damp earth. I promised myself 2 things. I would find out who did this, and I would rebuild. Not out of anger, but out of truth. For the next few days, I treated the ponds like a patient on the edge of life. I tested the water with what simple tools I had: litmus strips, smell, the color of the soil around the inlet. Everything pointed to one fact: some kind of chemical had seeped in, strong enough to suffocate fish overnight. The villagers came and went. Old farmers shook their heads and said, "It's not natural. Someone poured something." Others whispered names. I tried not to listen, but whispers have a way of turning into thoughts that keep you awake. When I walked through the market 2 mornings later, I caught fragments of talk. "Jealousy is a slow poison," one man said. "Blood turns bitter when money enters." He didn't have to say who he meant. I could feel the looks. Rohan had been restless since our father passed away. The land, the inheritance, the family home, everything had been divided fairly on paper, but never in spirit. I worked the ponds day and night. He drifted between jobs. When the farm began turning profit, his jokes turned sharper, his visits shorter. Still, I refused to accuse anyone without proof. Truth, I reminded myself, is heavy. You have to carry it carefully. So I began quietly watching. I checked the footpaths behind the farm where the irrigation ditch ran. One morning, I found faint boot prints in the soft earth, too large for mine, too recent to belong to any of the village children. Beside them lay a small plastic container with faded blue paint on the lid. I rinsed it. The water turned cloudy and smelled faintly of detergent or fertilizer. I carried the container to the local agricultural officer 2 villages over. He tested the residue and frowned. This is pesticide concentrate. A few capfuls can ruin a whole pond. My throat tightened. Someone had poured this into my water deliberately. That night, I sat on the veranda with the lantern dimmed low, listening to the frogs croak near the half-drained pond. I remembered the way Rohan had flicked his cigarette into the mud, the casual cruelty in his words. I didn't want to believe it, but denial is another kind of blindness. The next morning, I visited him. He was repairing his motorbike, sleeves rolled up, grease on his hands. "Rohan," I said, keeping my voice steady, "someone used pesticide on my ponds. I found the container." He didn't look up. "And you think it was me?" "I'm not saying that, though my heartbeats said otherwise. But you were near the farm that night." He wiped his hands slowly, then met my eyes. "You think you're better than me because your fish bring in money now? Maybe fate decided to humble you." It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. The words hung between us like smoke. I left without another word. Accusations without proof would only tear the family apart faster. But inside, something shifted. I stopped waiting for him to admit anything. I started planning how to rebuild, even if I had to start from one surviving fish and a handful of honesty. Because truth, I told myself, doesn't shout. It waits until you're strong enough to speak it. The morning the truth began to show itself was bright and cruelly beautiful. The sky was clear, the air smelled clean, and yet my heart felt heavy as I walked toward the community well. Everyone was there, farmers, vendors, the same neighbors who had watched me build my ponds from nothing. They stopped talking when I arrived. "Any luck with the fish?" someone asked softly. "None," I said. "But I know what killed them." I held up the empty container I'd found, now sealed in a clear bag. "Pesticide. Someone poured this into the water." Murmurs spread through the crowd. One of the older men, known for his bluntness, stepped forward. "That's not something done by accident. Who had reason to harm you?" I hesitated. The village was small, every word echoed, but truth doesn't live forever in silence. "Someone who wanted to see me fail," I said. "Someone who knows the farm as well as I do." A few people exchanged glances. I didn't have to name him. Jealousy, like smoke, always points toward its source. By evening, the talk had reached every doorstep. Rohan avoided me for days. He stopped coming to the tea stall, stopped visiting our mother's house. Still, I said nothing publicly. I wanted the facts to speak for themselves. Then, one night, the evidence came uninvited. A young boy who helped me fetch feed ran to my house breathless. "Baya, I saw Rohan washing barrels behind his shed. The water smelled like the pond that day." I followed the boy quietly. Under the faint glow of his lantern, I saw them. 2 blue containers stacked near Rohan's fence. The labels were half peeled, but the chemical name was the same as on the residue report. My heart sank. I didn't confront him then. I walked back home slowly, the night air cool against my face. My anger had burned itself out days ago. What remained was a kind of sadness that reached deeper than rage. The next morning, I took the containers and the test results to the village council. It wasn't revenge I sought, only truth. The elders gathered in the courtyard beneath the neem tree. Rohan was summoned. He arrived looking tired, eyes red. One of the elders, a man who had known our family since before we were born, spoke first. "These are serious matters. If you have something to say it before the whole village." For a long moment, Rohan said nothing. Then he looked at me. His voice cracked. "I did it," he said quietly. "I was angry. Everyone praised him, called him hard-working. I thought if his pawns failed, people would remember me again." The words fell like stones. No one spoke. Even the birds seemed to stop. Finally, the eldest councilman sighed. "Jealousy is a poison, my boy. You've killed more than fish. You've killed trust." Rohan lowered his head. I felt no victory in his confession, only a hollow ache. After the meeting, he approached me outside. "I'll fix it. I'll help you start again." I looked at him, really looked at him. He was still my brother by blood, but something between us had broken. "If you mean it, then start by telling the truth everywhere it's needed. That's how we clean what's been poisoned." He nodded, tears streaking through the dust on his face. That night, I walked back to the pond. The moon shone on the water's dull surface, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a faint sense of peace. The truth, heavy as it was, had finally surfaced. And the water, though wounded, could heal again.
The days after Rohan's confession were strange, quiet but full of unspoken emotions. The villagers now knew the truth, and though some pitied me, I didn't want pity. I wanted peace, and I wanted to see life return to my pawns. The morning after the council meeting, I stood by the largest pond and watched as sunlight touched the still water. Dead leaves floated where fish once swam. It would take months to clear the toxins, to make the water safe again. But I wasn't afraid of work. I'd built everything once before, and I would do it again. I started by draining the worst pond completely. With a shovel and an old bucket, I removed every trace of sludge, turning the soil, letting it dry in the sun. Rohan came on the second day. He didn't speak at first, just picked up a rake and began working beside me. We didn't look at each other much, but silence can sometimes say what words cannot. After a while, he said quietly, "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not sure I can give it yet. But we both have to live in this village. Let's start with fixing what we can." He nodded. We worked until sunset, the rhythm of shovels and splashing water slowly easing the bitterness between us. Neighbors saw us working side by side and began to help. One man brought sacks of clean sand. Another lent his water pump. That's the way villages heal, one act of kindness at a time. In the evenings, I sat by the fire, making notes in a small notebook. New filtration methods, possible feed suppliers, precautions against chemical runoff. The government officer I'd met earlier visited once a week, testing samples, guiding me on how to neutralize the contaminated soil. He told me I could apply for compensation. I thanked him, but said, "All I need is clean water again." Slowly, green life returned. Algae began forming again. Then insects, then the first few fry from a nearby hatchery. Each ripple in the water was like a heartbeat. Rohan kept helping. He rebuilt the fence, repaired the storage shed, even replaced the old pump with one he bought from selling his motorbike. One evening he said, "I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure your hard work doesn't die because of my foolishness." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Our hard work." He smiled weakly, but there was something new in his eyes. Remorse? Maybe. or a kind of peace that comes only after truth has stripped a person bare. By the third month, small fish flickered in the shallows again. The water was clear, reflecting the sky instead of the past. I found myself humming as I worked. Sometimes Rohan joined in softly. When the first harvest of the new season came, it wasn't large, but every single fish felt like a miracle. We sold them at the market, side by side, without saying much. People noticed, though. They saw not just the fish, but the lesson behind them. That night, my mother called both of us to dinner. She placed her hands on our shoulders and said simply, "Water cleans everything, even hearts, if you let it." And in that moment, I knew the rebuilding wasn't just of ponds or profit. It was of family and of truth made visible through hard work. By the time the next planting season began, word of the rebuilt ponds had spread beyond our village. Traders who once avoided my farm now stopped by again. They asked cautious questions, tested the water, smiled when they saw how clear it ran. The first few sales were small, nothing close to what I used to earn, but every handshake felt like a small vote of confidence. Trust doesn't rush back, it walks slowly, step by step. Rohan and I divided the work naturally. He handled the feed and the repairs, I took care of stocking and marketing. We spoke little about the past, yet every day of labor became an apology and an acceptance rolled into one. Sometimes, when the sun was low and the ponds glowed gold, I caught him standing by the water, lost in thought. He looked younger somehow, as if honesty had lightened something inside him. The villagers began to notice. An old farmer named Malik stopped by one evening with a jar of pond clay. He said, "Spread this on the bottom. It will balance the minerals." Then he added quietly, "Good to see you two working together again. Truth may hurt, but it heals faster than lies." At the next village gathering, the headman asked me to speak about what had happened. I hesitated. Stories of shame are hard to tell aloud. But then I thought of the younger farmers watching me, the ones just starting out. I told them everything, not as an accusation, but as a lesson. "I learned," I said, "that success means little if it divides the family that built it, and that jealousy doesn't die when we hide it. It dies when we name it." The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then someone began to clap. The sound spread until the whole courtyard echoed with it. After that day, the weight I'd been carrying seemed to lift. People stopped whispering. They began asking for advice instead. Children came to see the fish hatchlings. Even the air felt lighter, as if the farm itself had exhaled. One evening, after a long day of feeding, I sat by the pond and watched the ripples fade. The sky turned violet, the frogs began their chorus, and Rohan brought 2 cups of tea. He said, "You ever think that maybe we both had to go through this to learn what matters?" I nodded. Maybe the poison wasn't just in the water. We drank quietly, listening to the soft splash of fish surfacing. For the first time in months, the sound didn't hurt. It felt like forgiveness. As months passed, the rhythm of life returned to the farm, but I was no longer the same person who had once measured success only in profit and yield. The ponds had taught me something deeper, that what you nurture with honesty grows strong, and what you feed with envy dies quietly. Each morning, when I walked along the narrow dikes, the mist would hover over the water like a curtain. Beneath it, I could see the fish darting, alive again, silver and quick. Every glimmer reminded me of the day I thought it was all over, and how truth, painful as it was, had been the start of something cleaner. Villagers now brought their children to see the ponds. "Look," they'd say, "this is where hard work beats bad luck." I'd smile politely, but inside,
I knew it wasn't luck that had ruined or restored my farm. It was human choice. Rohan, too, had changed. He rose before dawn, worked without complaint, and spoke gently to everyone he once scorned. There were still awkward silences between us, but they no longer stung. Instead, they felt like pauses between steps on a road we were both learning to walk again. One afternoon, as we cleaned the filter pipes, he said quietly, "You know, I don't deserve your forgiveness." I set down my wrench. I said, "Maybe not, but forgiveness isn't something we earn. It's something we grow into, like the fish, after the water clears." He looked at me and for the first time truly smiled. Not the nervous half smile of guilt, but one that reached his eyes. I decided to start a new practice then. Once a week, I recorded short notes about the farm, what went right, what went wrong, what I'd learned. It wasn't for profit or publicity, just a record of truth. Later, I realized these recordings could help others who were struggling too. That's when I began sharing my story with honesty, not to shame anyone, but to remind people that the truth, however late, is the only thing that makes healing possible. In one of those recordings, I said, "Water holds memory. It keeps what we put into it, our care, our mistakes, our hopes. If we poison it, it dies. But if we clean it with patience, it forgives us." Maybe people are the same. As I replayed that sentence, I felt something shift inside me. For so long, I'd thought I was rebuilding a farm, but in truth, I was rebuilding faith in myself, in family, and in the quiet power of honesty. When the next harvest came, the ponds shimmered like mirrors. Every reflection of the sky felt like a promise that the past had been faced and forgiven. And as we pulled up the nets heavy with life once again, I realized that sometimes the deepest growth comes not from what we plant, but from what we survive.
The sun was setting the evening I realized the farm had finally come full circle. The sky burned with colors, orange, rose, and a shade of gold that mirrored the fish as they rippled through the water. The same ponds that had once stunk of poison now gleamed like liquid light. I stood there barefoot, feeling the mud cool under my feet. Around me, the village was quiet. Only the distant sound of cows, the laughter of children playing by the road, and the faint buzz of evening insects. Everything felt at peace, not because life had become perfect, but because it had become honest again. Rohan walked up beside me. He didn't speak. He just handed me a cup of tea and looked out at the ponds. The steam curled upward like a silent offering. After a moment, he said softly, "You are right. Water remembers everything. I used to think truth was something that could destroy people, but now I see it's what keeps them alive." I smiled. "Truth doesn't destroy," I said. "Lies do. Truth only hurts until it's spoken." We watched the fish break the surface, catching the last light of the sun. That moment felt sacred, as if nature itself had forgiven us both. The villagers began calling my place the Honest Farm. It wasn't a name I chose, but it fit. Parents sent their sons to learn there, not just about fish, but about trust. They saw that you can lose everything and still find a way to rebuild if you hold on to truth. One evening, I set up my camera near the pond and began recording what would become the story I'm telling you now. I didn't want to dramatize it or hide behind fancy words. I wanted it to sound the way it happened, plain, real, full of the same mud and sweat that shaped me. I said to the camera, "This isn't a story about fish or money. It's a story about honesty, about how jealousy can poison what we love most, and about how water, like truth, finds its own level. It always comes clean in the end." When I posted that video, I didn't expect anyone to care, but messages started coming from other farmers, families,
Even strangers in cities who said the story reminded them of their own struggles, with trust, with loss, with family. That's when I understood. Stories like this don't belong to one person. They belong to everyone who's ever faced betrayal and chosen to heal instead of hate. Now, when I walk through my farm at dawn, I whisper a small prayer. Not for success, but for clarity. For my water, for my work, and for my heart to stay clean. Because I've learned that in the end, truth and water are the same. Both can be clouded, both can be poisoned, but both, if tended with care, will always find their way back to purity. And that, I believe, is the real harvest.
In life, not every wound leaves a scar you can see. Some live in silence, like poisoned water, calm on the surface, deadly beneath. But truth, no matter how painful, is the medicine that heals it. When I watched my fish die, I thought my world had ended. I didn't know it was beginning again. This time on honesty, not illusion. My story isn't about revenge or loss. It's about courage, forgiveness, and the quiet power of truth. If your life feels poisoned, remember this. Clean it one act at a time. Speak truth. Work hard. Forgive when you can, and when you can't, keep your heart clear, like water, learning to run again. Because no matter who hurts you or what's lost, honesty will always bring life back to the surface.